Hello and welcome back to Two Dancing Clams. In part 3 of this tutorial, we'll cover constructing the stem and adding parameters to the mushroom generator. Compared to what we've just done, the stem itself is pretty trivial. First of all, I want to kill this again because the group output, because I want to get a local view as we create the stem so we can see the progress. I know I'm going to want to control the stem length, so create a value. I do this a lot. And this is going to be stem length. And this is going to form the Z coordinate. Stems go up and down. Excellent. This is going to form the endpoint of a curved line. So, curved line. Actually, I'm not sure it matters, but I want this to be the end. And we've created a line. Okay, so good. Now, in order to be a proper mushroom stem, we need to do two things. One, we need to give it a lot more control points because we're going to make it an interesting shape. So resample this. And we don't need a whole lot. Now, we have a curve. The easiest way to give thickness to a curve is using a lovely little box called set curve radius. Now we still see our basic line. The reason is because the only thing set curve radius does is it changes a value inside the geometry, but it doesn't automatically the geometry doesn't automatically do anything with that value. So we will do something later with that value. We will do a curved mesh, but not right yet. So we will do a curve to mesh to give it some thickness. Now that doesn't do anything until you give it a profile curve. So let's do that. Let's just give it a circle. And now you can see, instead of a line, we have a tube. Let's fill the ends. Hopefully, I don't think we'll be able to see the ends. One's generally on the ground and the other one should be buried inside the mushroom, but why not? And we can control the radius of this. Yay. But we don't want a tube. We want something interesting, something that's got a bit of context to it. So, let's control this radius. I want to do two things with it. One, I want to give the user control. I want to give myself control. So again, a value node. And we'll call this stem thickness. And I also want to be able to shape the node. Now there's two things that can go into shaping node. One, an interesting curve. So my favorite way to get an interesting curve is a float curve. I mean, I know we started off this thing with a whole bunch of math to generate an interesting curve. And actually, you know, you could do interesting math to do this here. But for simple things like this, it's just so much faster to not dream up a bunch of equations. Just go with something that's more artistic. Now, fixed float curve needs a value between 0 and 1 in order to work on. So at the 0 value, you will get this as output, and as it goes toward 1 output, we'll get this, which is not terribly interesting, but that's what the float curve itself is for. Where do we get that 0 to 1 value? That comes from our curve. So the spline vector. Okay, now if all is right with the world, we have a stem. Kind of a boring stem because it's just following this linear float curve. So let's give it some interesting contours. Let's give it some thickness at the ground level. And let's not max it out at the end. Want the beginning and the end to not be too different from each other. And let's give it a little S. This is basically just a question of eyeballing it. And that's good enough. I mean, you could go elaborate with this. You could introduce some noise if you wanted to. Generally, I didn't like the result I got when I put noise into this in the simplest possible way. For one thing, it tends to move the bottom of the mushroom around, which can tip up the bottom of the mushroom. So you have the base facing the camera. You'd have to stick that in the ground or figure out the way to keep that from happening. Also, then the top of the mushroom wanders around. You could use tricks to make the cap automatically follow the position and the rotation of the stem. It's hard to get it right, and it's really fiddly. What I find it's much easier to do is just leave this straight, stick the cap on top of it, and then if you want to add some noise, add noise to everything at once. And that way everything like when you bend the whole mushroom bends in the same direction. The stem gets more interesting, the cap gets more interesting. That's a lot easier than applying randomness to everything and then trying to stick them together afterwards. So if we've done this, now we can take this back to the end. So believe it or not, we are not as far off as you might think. So there's two problems with this. One, the stem is going the wrong direction. It should go down instead of up. And we also need to do something about the scale. Let's fix the direction first. So this is going to be a simple matter of adding a math node to switch the direction. Again, I like to do that by multiplying by -1. Now we're going down. Now we need to increase the stem length to something that we can see. Okay. And we need to increase the stem thickness to something that's reasonable. Okay, we can play with this more later. There's one thing I'd like to fix before we go any further. That is, you'll notice that the mushroom is going downward from the origin. If you want to create a bunch of mushrooms to populate your world, it is very handy to keep the origin of all your objects at the bottom of the object. So we want to move the mushroom up by the entire mushroom height, which it turns out is just this. So we're going to create a vector to move to adjust upwards by the stem length and z-axis. That will come over here. And we'll use it for a set position. And we will move everything. We'll use it for the offset in the set position. Now our mushroom is sitting on the axis. A couple of more things. First of all, let's give this some realistic proportions before we move on, just because we're going to have to look at it for a while. So I want the gill position to start a little bit further up. I'd like to put some randomness back into it so we can have something more, make it just a little more interesting to look at. Not that. Let's create some more gills too. That's looking a little bit anemic. You know what? This is dumb. There's no reason for this to be an integer, or there's no reason for this to be a float. Let's make this an integer. Much better. And I also want to go back and give it some waviness using the, there, that's looking more like it. Okay. One thing I want to do is, you can add a hue, okay. One more thing. Let us make the gills go out just a little bit more. That's looking like it. All this is looking janky now. We could subdivide the mesh a little bit. We could also add some smoothness. That will happen just in a few minutes. Okay. One thing I really want to do that adds a whole lot of interest to this is allow the mushroom to bend as a unit. So this will be accomplished with a set position, as always. And we are going to use a vector rotate. Now what we're going to do is modify the position of each point. So every point in here is going to be modified by this operation. What we want to do is we're going to rotate around an axis. We're going to rotate around the x-axis. X or Y, it doesn't matter. The only one we don't want to use is Z because that would basically just twist the object, which actually could be interesting. Never tried it before. What we want to do now is to determine the amount it's going to bend. What I want to do is have it bend, move just a little bit more the farther it is away from the Z origin. So we want the Z value. And we could just run that in here. Yay. Much too much. So let's give us a way to modify this. So we'll add a multiply node. What will we multiply by? We will multiply by something in the user interface. Another value node, you say? Oh, yes. And we'll call this global bending. Now, this is really touchy, but it's very cool. Like it a lot. And you notice we're only bending along the x-axis. So there's two things to do. We could, one, give the user a way to provide the axis that we're going to bend around, or we can just bend around the x and then also provide a way to rotate the mushroom. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I think it's more intuitive to give them a way to rotate and bend separately. So let us do that next. Another set position node? Don't mind if I do. Again, this is going to be a rotate. This time we will be rotating around the Z. And what we are rotating is the position. By an amount, what amount? Whatever the user says, a value node. I do like repeating my own tricks. Call this one global rotation. So now we can bend how we like and rotate how we like. A few more details to clean up before we start the textures. And the textures will go really fast because you don't need anything very elaborate for this. One thing I want to do is I want to get the parameters that are adjustable in a more convenient place. So the easiest way to do that is to add them to the group input. So Shift-A, search for group input. And if I take this angle and I drag it over here, we get a new input to our group geometry, which is essentially a very redundant thing I just said. But what you can see is it appeared over here. And that's how you get this nice row of controls to control everything about your geometry nodes. So we can get rid of this. And if you open the group tab over here, that gives you a more convenient way to edit these things. So I can call this global rotation. Maybe I'll have to spell it right this time. And you can also give bounds to it. So in this case, I know that there's probably no reason to go more than minus pi, half a circle negative, and pi, circle positive. So now, instead of having to fish through these geometry nodes to find the interesting things to change, we can just go over here. And as you can see, it rotates. Yay! So I'm going to go through and set everything over here. Over here, yeah, you can see where I'm pointing. I'm going to go through and set up all the parameters we care about. In addition to getting the input parameter set, I also want to do something about the textures. Now, we're going to have 4 textures on this object: stem, gills, inside of cap, outside of cap. So let me add 4 materials for those. Excellent. Doesn't matter which is which, but we'll just call this cap outside. Cap inside. Stem. Gills. To have 4 textures operating simultaneously on this object, we need to have 4 slots filled in. In addition, I know I am going to want to control these colors also from the modifier for the object. So I just need some way to add those colors to the group input that will get them over here. And then in a moment, I'll show you also how to get them on the group output. And by putting them on the group output and giving them attribute names, we'll be able to use them inside of our materials. Show you how to do that later. First of all, we just need these colors in the input. So I can create a new input, and I want it to be a color. And I want this to be cap outside. And now I want 3 more. I'll label this one cap inside, and this one stem, and this one gills. Now I just need to go back and make sure that all the places I've done set material correspond to those. So I can call this gills, And then for the cap, we did these two set materials so long ago. I'll call this outside. We'll call this inside. Did I remember which is which? It's about a coin flip. And then the stem, which I don't think I did a set material for. So let's do that now. And we'll call this stem. Also, this cap is looking a little bit rough, so it's probably time to go ahead and do a little smoothing. I don't think there's any reason not to just go ahead and smooth everything. So we'll do a Shift-A search, set shade smooth. If you wanted to, we could also add a subdivision surface. I'm not sure it's necessary, and I'm not sure I really want the extra geometry on this. We've got quite a bit already. Your wants and needs may vary. Okay, I'm going to go through and finish up the rest of the input nodes. See you in a minute.